In the high-stakes arena of international trade, a seismic shift has unfolded, one that has caught not only the United States off guard, but also its steadfast ally, Canada. What seemed like just another policy adjustment has now sent shockwaves through global markets, leaving leaders scrambling to respond. The European Union's latest move isn't just bold, it's a game changer that could redefine economic alliances for years to come. So what exactly happened, and why is everyone talking about it? Let's dive in. The catalyst: US tariffs ignite global tensions. It all began with a bold and controversial proclamation from President Donald Trump on a 25% tariff on imported steel and aluminum. Announced as part of his America First economic strategy, this move was intended to revitalize domestic manufacturing, protect American jobs, and reduce reliance on foreign production. "We must protect our American workers and industries," Trump declared, positioning the decision as a necessary step to safeguard national economic interests. However, while the policy was framed as a protective measure for American industry, it sent shockwaves through the global economy. The tariff was seen not just as an economic decision, but as a direct challenge to long-standing trade partnerships and agreements. For decades, the United States had played a leading role in promoting free trade through institutions like the World Trade Organization, WTO, fostering economic cooperation with allies. But this abrupt shift signaled a departure from diplomatic trade norms, triggering immediate backlash from key economic partners, including the European Union and Canada. In Europe, policymakers and industry leaders expressed outrage, warning that such a move would not only destabilize international supply chains, but also risk a dangerous precedent of economic protectionism. European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker swiftly condemned the tariffs, calling them a blatant intervention in free trade that cannot go unanswered. Similarly, Canada, one of the largest exporters of steel and aluminum to the US, saw the tariffs as an unjustified attack on its economy and a betrayal of North American trade relations. As diplomatic tensions escalated, the possibility of a full-scale trade war loomed. Retaliatory measures were not just discussed, they were actively being crafted behind closed doors in Brussels and Ottawa. The European Union, long a champion of free markets and multilateral cooperation, was not about to stand idly by. Instead, they began strategizing a counterplay that would not only challenge the US tariffs, but reshape the global trade order in ways that few had anticipated. What came next would leave Washington stunned, shake the foundations of international commerce, and force the world's largest economies into a high-stakes showdown with far-reaching consequences. The EU's strategic countermeasure. As tensions between the United States and its key trading partners reached a boiling point, the European Union took decisive action, unveiling a comprehensive and meticulously crafted list of counter-tariffs aimed directly at the heart of American industries. The EU's response was not just a simple act of retaliation, it was a strategic maneuver designed to maximize economic and political pressure on Washington, while reinforcing the message that unilateral trade aggression would not go unchallenged. At a highly anticipated press conference in Brussels, EU officials stood united as they announced countermeasures that would affect approximately 18 billion euros worth of US exports. The targeted goods were not chosen at random, rather they were carefully selected to strike where it would hurt the most, industries with deep political significance and strong domestic influence in the US. Among the most notable items on the list were Harley-Davidson motorcycles, Kentucky bourbon, and Levi's jeans, all of which symbolize classic American craftsmanship and identity. Speaking to the media, EU Trade Commissioner addressed the growing concerns over the escalating trade dispute, emphasizing that the EU was not seeking confrontation, but rather defending itself against what it saw as an unjustified attack on global trade stability. The move signaled that Europe was willing to use its economic might to push back against Washington's aggressive policies, setting the stage for a trade battle with far-reaching consequences. Beyond the economic implications, the counter-tariffs also carried significant political weight. The EU deliberately targeted industries that were based in key US states with strong political influence, particularly those that were crucial to President Trump's voter base. The inclusion of bourbon was a direct hit on Kentucky, the home state of Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, while tariffs on motorcycles affected Wisconsin, the birthplace of Harley-Davidson, a company that had already been vocal about the negative impact of trade wars. By putting pressure on these industries, the EU hoped to create internal political resistance within the US, forcing lawmakers to reconsider the trade policies that had provoked the dispute in the first place. The European response was swift, calculated, and backed by unwavering unity among its member states. Unlike the fractured approach that often characterized EU decision-making, the trade dispute with the US served as a unifying force, demonstrating that Europe was capable of standing its ground against the world's largest economy. The question now was how Washington would react. Would the US escalate the conflict further, or would it attempt to negotiate a way out of the rapidly intensifying standoff? As tensions continued to mount, the world watched closely. The stakes were no longer just about tariffs and trade policies. This was now a battle for economic dominance and geopolitical influence on a global scale. The Canadian conundrum. As the trade dispute between the United States and the European Union intensified, Canada, America's closest neighbor and longtime ally, found itself caught in the crossfire. The nation, known for its historically strong economic ties with the US, was suddenly forced into a precarious and deeply consequential position. The tariffs imposed by Washington had severe ramifications for Canadian industries, sending shockwaves through manufacturing, agriculture, and key export sectors. With public frustration mounting and economic uncertainty spreading, Canadian Prime Minister took to the national stage to address the concerns of both citizens and business leaders. Flanked by members of his cabinet, he delivered an impassioned speech that underscored the gravity of the situation. "We will not stand idly by as our sovereignty and economic stability are threatened," he declared. His words met with both applause and apprehension. The Prime Minister made it clear that Canada would not be bullied into submission, and that his government was prepared to take drastic measures to protect national interests. However, the economic crisis was quickly morphing into a political firestorm. Opposition parties accused the government of failing to anticipate the fallout of US protectionist policies, while business leaders warned that retaliatory measures could worsen the economic strain on Canadian companies. As uncertainty gripped the nation, calls for decisive action grew louder. Under immense political pressure, the Prime Minister made an unprecedented announcement. He would call for a snap election, framing the trade dispute as the most significant crisis of our lifetimes. The move was both a high-stakes gamble and a strategic calculation. By taking the issue to the people, the Prime Minister sought to rally national unity and secure a strong mandate to negotiate from a position of strength. The election would not only serve as a referendum on his leadership, but also as a defining moment in Canada's economic future. Would voters support a hardline stance against US trade policies, or would they opt for a more conciliatory approach to de-escalate tensions? As election campaigns ramped up, debates raged across the country. Citizens worried about job losses, business closures, and rising costs of essential goods. Industries dependent on US trade, from auto manufacturing to dairy farming, faced an uncertain future. Meanwhile, economic analysts speculated on the potential long-term effects of a fractured US-Canada trade relationship, with some warning that it could reshape North American trade dynamics for generations. With diplomatic relations hanging by a thread, Canada stood at a crossroads. The nation's response to the crisis would not only determine its economic trajectory, but also redefine its standing on the world stage. As election day neared, the world watched with bated breath, waiting to see whether Canada would double down on its defiance or seek a path toward reconciliation. Unexpected ripples, global economic repercussions. The European Union's bold countermeasure against US tariffs did more than just challenge Washington's trade policies. It sent shockwaves through the global economy, triggering a chain reaction that threatened financial stability across multiple industries and continents. As the world's largest economies engaged in a high-stakes game of economic brinkmanship, businesses, workers, and investors braced for the fallout. Industries reliant on transatlantic trade found themselves in a state of deep uncertainty. European manufacturers that depended on American raw materials scrambled to find alternative suppliers, while US companies that relied on European exports faced crippling import taxes. The iconic American industries targeted by the EU, motorcycles, bourbon, and fashion, reported sharp declines in international sales, forcing some companies to lay off workers or shift production overseas to avoid the tariffs. The impact extended far beyond the US and Europe. Emerging economies, many of which were deeply intertwined with global supply chains, felt the ripple effects of disrupted trade routes and volatile currency fluctuations. Markets in Asia, South America, and Africa saw capital flight and investment slowdowns as uncertainty gripped international financial systems. Stock markets tumbled, with investors fearing that escalating trade wars could push major economies into recession. Prominent economic analysts and financial institutions began issuing stark warnings about the long-term consequences of prolonged economic conflict. In a widely circulated report, an expert cautioned these tit-for-tat tariffs could push economies into recession if not resolved promptly. With global GDP growth already slowing, policymakers worried that an extended trade war could undermine economic recovery efforts following previous financial crises. Beyond trade, diplomatic relations frayed as nations were forced to choose sides in the dispute. Countries that traditionally aligned with the US were caught in an uncomfortable balancing act, trying to maintain good relations with Washington while also protecting their own economic interests. Meanwhile, China watched the unfolding crisis with keen interest, seeing an opportunity to expand its own economic influence as Western nations clashed. As economic tensions mounted, the world faced a defining moment. Would global leaders find a way to negotiate a resolution before irreversible damage was done, or was the international economy on the brink of a full-blown trade catastrophe? The answers remained uncertain, but one thing was clear: the consequences of this escalating trade war would be felt for years to come. Canada's unforeseen dilemma. As the trade war between the United States and the European Union escalated, Canada found itself in an unenviable position, trapped between two economic giants locked in a bitter standoff. Historically dependent on trade with both the US and Europe, Canada suddenly faced tough choices that could shape its economic future for decades to come. While Washington remained its largest trading partner, the EU's countermeasures and shifting global alliances presented both risks and opportunities. Inside government offices in Ottawa, emergency meetings were held behind closed doors as top officials scrambled to develop a strategy that would shield Canada from the worst economic fallout. Ministers, trade experts, and industry leaders debated fiercely. Should Canada align itself more closely with the EU to reduce dependence on the US, or attempt to mend relations with Washington to avoid further disruption? Each choice carried potential consequences, and with billions of dollars in trade at stake, there was little room for error. Meanwhile, across the country, citizens took to the streets in support of local businesses, many of which were bearing the brunt of the economic uncertainty. Small manufacturers, farmers, and retailers, many of whom relied heavily on exports to both the US and Europe, were now facing supply chain disruptions, higher costs, and an unpredictable future. Farmers in particular voiced concerns over potential retaliatory tariffs on agricultural exports, warning that prolonged trade disputes could cripple the industry and drive family-run farms out of business. At a press conference aimed at calming public anxiety, Canadian Trade Minister addressed the growing uncertainty. "We must navigate these turbulent waters carefully to safeguard our national interests," he stated, emphasizing that Canada's response would be measured, strategic, and guided by the principle of economic sovereignty. His words reassured some, but for many industries on the front line of the crisis, they offered little immediate relief. As the situation unfolded, Canada's balancing act became more precarious by the day. Would the country find a way to diversify its trade partnerships, leveraging the crisis as an opportunity to strengthen ties with Europe and Asia, or would it be forced to concede to US pressure, prioritizing economic stability over diplomatic independence? With global markets watching closely, the decisions made in the coming weeks would not only determine Canada's economic trajectory, but also reshape its role in the evolving global trade order. The nation stood at a crossroads, and whichever path it chose, one thing was certain: there was no turning back. The path forward: diplomacy or economic warfare? With the global economy teetering on the edge of uncertainty, international leaders convened for a series of high-stakes emergency trade talks, hoping to diffuse tensions before the situation spiraled further out of control. The world watched as delegations from the United States, the European Union, Canada, and other key economies gathered behind closed doors, seeking a path forward that could prevent a full-scale economic crisis. The stakes had never been higher. Would diplomacy win the day, or was the world heading toward prolonged economic warfare? The negotiations were tense, with each side determined to protect its interests. US officials stood firm, insisting that their tariffs were necessary to correct trade imbalances and protect American jobs. Meanwhile, EU and Canadian representatives argued that unilateral tariffs violated international trade agreements and risked destabilizing the entire global economy. Heated debates unfolded in press conferences, where leaders carefully crafted statements that projected strength without entirely closing the door on compromise. Throughout the discussions, handshake deals were exchanged, some tentative agreements were made, but deep divisions remained. Behind the public diplomacy, there was growing pressure from businesses, workers, and economists worldwide who feared that continued economic hostilities could push multiple economies into recession. A growing number of analysts and policymakers warned that if the crisis was not resolved, global trade networks could be permanently altered, leaving lasting scars on international commerce. In a widely circulated statement, an international relations expert underscored the gravity of the moment, warning, diplomacy is crucial at this juncture to prevent further economic fallout. While some leaders advocated for a gradual de-escalation of tariffs through diplomatic compromise, others warned that failing to take a hard stance against economic aggression could set a dangerous precedent for future trade conflicts. As negotiations dragged on, the world held its breath. Would leaders find common ground and restore stability, or were they merely delaying the inevitable? A future defined by economic protectionism, fractured alliances, and a new era of trade wars. With the global economy hanging in the balance, the answer to that question would shape the course of international relations for years to come.